Something is in motion, though it wears no crown of spectacle. This phase does not parade itself in silver light or crimson shadow, it hides its pulse beneath the skin of the night. The untrained eye will see only absence, a quiet gap in the familiar rhythm of the skies. Yet absence is never empty, it is a pressure waiting for release. In this passage of days, subtle mechanisms rearrange the unseen architecture of events. The world continues as if nothing has shifted, yet the ground beneath every choice feels softer, less certain. How many moments in life arrive without announcement, shaping entire paths before anyone notices they have begun? Its power lies in evasion. While attention is given to celestial displays that roar with beauty, this cycle whispers, folding new patterns into reality where no one is looking. It is not the kind of threshold that can be admired from a distance, it is a passage that pulls whatever stands near into its current. If the wrong presences occupy that space, their unrest seeps in, binding itself to the future like dye in fabric. The danger is not in what is visible but in what is silently transferred. How many times has an unseen influence rewritten the script while everyone believed the page was still blank? If this message resonated, share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There is an edge to this moment, as if the ordinary fabric of time is being trimmed with deliberate care. This is not randomness, it is precision disguised as stillness. It selects, it narrows, it redirects, leaving no margin for chance. In this narrow interval, the difference between growth and collapse can be as thin as breath. It raises an unspoken question: what forces are allowed near when the blueprint of the next chapter is drawn? And when the door closes on this interval, will the shape of what entered be recognized, or only felt in the outcomes that follow? There are moments when absence becomes an instruction, and this one carries a very clear directive: step out of reach. Not out of fragility, but to prevent the subtle theft of equilibrium. In this span of darkness, identity receives no reflection, no outer signal to confirm its form, leaving the inner field exposed. In such a vacuum, emotions that do not belong can seep in unnoticed, altering the current without consent. Proximity becomes a transaction, and the cost is measured in clarity lost. The surrounding air is saturated with static, panic, deception, unresolved longing, seeking any open channel. One exchange, one careless response, could shift the trajectory of what follows. When the pull to vanish into solitude rises from within, it is not retreat, it is alignment with an approaching tide that will not slow for stragglers. Perception itself is under a quiet siege, and the most treacherous part is how convincing the counterfeit signals can feel. This distortion is born from the lunar absence, when the night holds no reflection to anchor instinct. Decision-making tools that normally operate with precision, intuition, emotional resonance, subtle insight, become unreliable under this dimming of the inner compass. Stillness, in such conditions, does not always sharpen truth, at times it bends it, creating a false horizon. A surge of boldness might disguise inflated self-importance, while an ache of emptiness could simply be the hush between movements. Even the sudden urge to reconnect with what was once familiar may not originate from the self, but from another's pull echoing through the space. The real danger lies not in the silence itself, but in mistaking distortion for guidance, and doing so without ever hearing the moment it began. There is a kind of stillness that doesn't comfort, but reconfigures. In this cycle, it is not the noise of the world that poses the greatest risk, but the quiet gaps where foreign frequencies can slip in unnoticed. Without the usual mirrors of interaction, identity drifts without tether, and in that drift, the emotions, doubts, and hidden agendas of others find space to root themselves. What begins as a casual encounter or harmless conversation can, in this phase, act like a seed lodged in unfamiliar soil, growing into choices and moods that feel personal, yet were never truly born from within. The atmosphere is swollen with currents of unrest, old wounds seeking hosts, and narratives desperate to find a listener. Stepping aside is not about isolation for its own sake, it is about keeping the field unclouded long enough for the blueprint of what comes next to remain untampered. And what comes next is swift, relentless, and entirely indifferent to those still carrying the weight of another's storm. In such a blackout, even the most trusted inner senses can turn traitor. Without reflection, there is no confirmation of true north, only an unlit expanse where any flicker of feeling could be mistaken for a guiding star. This distortion has a strange confidence to it. It doesn't arrive with doubt, but with a convincing certainty that tempts immediate action. A sudden rush of purpose could be the inflated shadow of ego, just as a hollow ache could be the misread signal of quiet transformation. Urges to revisit the past, rekindle connections, or act on unshaped impulses may not be the soul's call at all, but the reverberation of someone else's unspoken pull. The most unsettling truth is that this interference doesn't shout, it hums, blending into the natural rhythm until the choice it influences feels entirely one's own. And by the time the moon returns to light, the path may already be set in a direction that was never truly chosen. Distortion under this sky will not arrive as static or alarm, it will arrive dressed as certainty. A sensation will rise, convincing in its texture, yet unmoored from truth. In such a state, every attempt to decode becomes premature, like reading a map while the ink is still moving across the page. Interpretation too soon will only anchor illusions. This phase is an invitation to witness without naming, to hold the sensation without shaping it into a verdict. First impulses may speak with authority, but in this particular lightless span, perception reveals not the whole scene, but the hollow spaces where pieces are missing. And here's the question: how much of what is felt is real, and how much is only the outline of what's absent? This narrow corridor of time acts like a living mechanism, opening and closing according to its own rhythm. It does not simply mark a night, but unfolds as a layered interval, 3 points strung together, with the present moment as its deepest point. The window is already in motion, the center of the tunnel has been reached. Missing a step here is not about losing an opportunity, it is about being sealed inside the momentum of what was left unaltered. In these 36 hours, the imprint of every choice is recorded, not in some abstract sense, but in the architecture of the next cycle itself. It's worth asking, if the passage is already listening, what exactly is it hearing now? Most squander this stretch without realizing it. They fill it with background chatter, distractions, mechanical routines, the filler that keeps the mind too occupied to notice a door standing open. They treat it as ordinary time, and by doing so, let the moment close without their signature. Space in its pure form is rare, and yet here it is, waiting for a conscious imprint. The discipline now is not in doing more, but in resisting the pull to do for the sake of filling silence. Whether through still movement, intentional withdrawal, or simply refusing unnecessary engagement, the page must remain empty until the right sentence finds it. Once filled with repetition, it cannot be rewritten until the cycle turns again. This is not the polished promise of beginnings. It is the raw dismantling before construction. The clearing is not sentimental, nor is it gentle, it strips away by necessity, removing structures that can't support what is next. That is why projects stall, words fade, and what once ignited excitement now tastes flat. It is not loss, it is preparation by subtraction. The vessel is being rinsed without asking for consent, because carrying the residue forward would poison the next pour. The sensation of being drained, irrelevant, or out of sync is not a verdict on worth, but a symptom of a deeper exchange, space being made, precisely where the old resisted leaving. The real test is not whether something new appears now, but whether there is room for it when it does. What unfolds now is not a refinement of old ambitions but a quiet dismantling of them. The current is severing attachments to structures once assumed to be permanent, clearing corridors the mind still believes are in use. This revision is not written in visible ink, it happens beyond conscious reach, where the framework is stripped down before the next architecture can rise. The fog, the pause, the silence, all are markers of this unseen construction site. Emptiness is not a void but a signal flare, the terrain is being leveled for something the present self would not yet recognize. Progress in this climate is not built by force, it emerges after the ground has been fully cleared. When the familiar slips away, perhaps it is not loss but the freeing of hands for what will demand their full grasp. The body, meanwhile, carries the proof before the mind understands. Disrupted rhythms appear, either an excess of rest or none at all. Nights break open at improbable hours, while days feel heavy and unyielding. Appetite swings between absence and sudden, uncharacteristic cravings, not as a matter of nourishment, but as the body recalibrates to a different current. A subtle sense of detachment may arise, as though hovering just outside the edges of one's own skin, watching movement from a step removed. This is not a malfunction, it is the frequency loosening from an identity now too narrow to hold it. Restlessness without clear cause, the constant checking of devices, the impulse to move without destination, these are signals of alignment with a timeline the intellect has not yet charted. The stillness in this interval is not stagnation, it is the digestion of a meal too complex to rush. There is no fixing these sensations, no need to label them as failure, weakness, or regression. Each strange pause, each shift in pace, each unexplainable quietude is part of a larger clearing, making space for a form of being that has yet to take shape. The discomfort is deliberate, as if the system must be emptied to the point where even subtle remnants of the old cannot survive. So let it remain unusual, let it remain unsettled, let it remain in between. The irregularity itself is the truest evidence that the work is real. Some transformations are so finely tuned they can only survive inside silence. In this phase, change works like a rare element, stable only when untouched by the weight of other presences. The moment another frequency enters, the structure weakens, the moment it is explained aloud, the charge begins to fade. This cycle is not requesting solitude as a preference, it is enforcing it as a condition. The alignment unfolding is a direct channel between the inner field and something far greater, and its form cannot be sustained by collective interpretation. Even quiet company holds gravity, and even supportive energy has the power to tilt the balance off-center. There is a reason certain awakenings are meant to bloom unseen, their permanence depends on it. If the room can be left empty, if the air can be kept still, the shift that takes place here will be one that no later force can undo. Signals during this passage may not arrive in the expected straight lines of reason. Instead, they slip in at odd angles, through interruptions, through sudden dissonance. The new structure of energy is nonlinear, and it delivers its messages through small fractures in the ordinary, a sound with no source, an object moved without memory, an overheard sentence that lands with inexplicable precision. Stillness creates the doorway, but the message steps through disguised as a disturbance. A sudden impulse to open a forgotten drawer, revisit an abandoned notebook, or follow a thought without context is not random, it is the form this kind of information takes. The trap is to dismiss it as accident, to ignore the shift in the air or the subtle distortion of time. When truly present, there is a moment when reality itself feels slightly altered, when the familiar bends, if only for a breath. That is the point to mark, without rushing to name or solve it. Sometimes the current stirs the air before revealing its voice. A knock, a break, a surge of unexplainable emotion, these are not interruptions but arrivals. Meeting them without retreat or distraction allows the recognition to settle, and once it does, the trajectory ahead is no longer the same. Some movements of change are so exacting they cannot withstand the friction of another's presence. They are like delicate threads spun in the dark, holding together only in the absence of outside weight. In this moment, transformation behaves as a rare mineral, stable only when kept in its native environment. The instant another energy steps into the space, even in silence, the weave begins to loosen. The act of speaking it aloud, of placing it into shared air, draws it back into the ordinary and dissolves its finer edges. This passage is not gently requesting solitude, it is enforcing it as a non-negotiable law. What unfolds here is an unmediated exchange between the inner frequency and a force beyond familiar categories. It cannot be replicated in company, nor preserved through explanation. Even the most supportive presence carries a subtle gravity, and gravity shifts the center. There is a rare wisdom in letting certain awakenings germinate in the dark, unseen, until they take root so deeply they are immune to interference. In the stillness, without witness, what emerges can bind itself to the core in ways no external validation could ever secure. The signs that arrive during this cycle will rarely follow the language of logic. They do not come as a neatly written letter but as fragments, bent pathways, and sudden interruptions. This is a form of communication that thrives in asymmetry, entering through side doors, catching attention with a flicker, a sound, a pause that stretches unnaturally. A faint tapping with no source. A phrase from a stranger that lands with the weight of a private revelation. An inexplicable urge to retrieve an object long forgotten. Such moments are not debris from the day, they are precise drops of information designed to bypass the thinking mind. The stiller the air, the more easily these signals cross the threshold. The mistake is to dismiss them as accident, to smooth over the irregularity, to rush past the instant when the air feels subtly altered. Presence in this space is less about discipline and more about noticing when reality shifts its temperature for a second. Often, the current will stir before it speaks, a phone call that breaks the quiet, a shadow passing across the wall, a swell of emotion that seems to have no origin. These disturbances are not obstacles but couriers. Staying with them, without numbing or fleeing, allows the message to finish its crossing. And when it does, the recognition will not feel like thought, it will feel like something ancient inside finally opening its eyes. The sudden dullness of the world is not a flaw in perception but the intentional dimming of its false lights. This phase does not arrive to ignite momentum or to flood the system with drive, it arrives to pull the plug. The usual peaks, the small jolts of approval, the background hum of comparison, the quiet pressure to be in motion, are cut at the source. What remains is not absence for the sake of deprivation, but a silence dense enough to allow signals of a different order to emerge. This is not the collapse of vitality, it is the dismantling of counterfeit sparks that once passed for life. In their place, there is a space between the last echo of stimulation and the first whisper of something genuine, and that space is profoundly still. The body and mind protest in this stillness. There is a restlessness that feels like boredom, a floating sensation that borders on meaninglessness, the uneasy sense that nothing is moving forward. Yet this is the reset in progress, the nervous system adjusting to a reality no longer propped up by manufactured highs. The familiar hooks no longer land, the loops of distraction fail to catch. It is a strange relief and an unfamiliar discomfort at once. The real question rises in the vacuum, without the steady drip of entertainment, praise, or friction, what truly calls from within. The confrontation is sharp because it strips away the layers of external direction until only raw preference remains. Most will run from it, a few will remain. Staying in that flatness is its own form of discipline. The muted days become a mirror, showing what is reached for when nothing is feeding the senses. The observation is the work, not in forcing vision, but in noticing the subtle patterns, what is missed, what is longed for, what is reached toward without immediate grasp. This restraint becomes the clearing in which the authentic compass can realign. And when it finally stirs, it will not shout. It will arrive as a steady pull, one that feels rooted not in impulse, but in recognition. The difference is unmistakable, not because it demands attention, but because it does not need to. The sudden flattening of sensation is not a malfunction but a deliberate recalibration. It is as if the circuitry that once ran on constant surges of artificial voltage has been shut down, leaving only the raw hum of the core system. This cycle does not arrive to push, excite, or inspire, it comes to sever the pipelines that deliver false vitality. The everyday hits, social validation, competitive comparison, the rush of constant input, are stripped away with the precision of a blackout. What's left is not emptiness in the way most fear it, but a clearing so vast that only what is real can find its way in. In the gap between the fading echo of overstimulation and the first honest impulse, there is no soundtrack. That silence, however unsettling, is where the deeper signals begin to move. In that hollowed space, the mind will search for familiar markers and find none. Restlessness will creep in, not as a symptom of failure, but as the body's way of adjusting to a new frequency. The hours may feel shapeless, too long, too quiet, while the nervous system flinches at the absence of its usual distractions. The old rewards no longer register, the feed scrolls without satisfaction, the chase feels weightless, the validation lands without depth. This is the detox at work. And here's the twist: what feels like a loss of drive is actually the shedding of borrowed momentum. Without those external jolts, the question can no longer be avoided: when no one is watching, when nothing is feeding the fire, what truly deserves movement? Most retreat from that confrontation, the few who don't discover an entirely different compass. Remaining in this muted state is an act of precision. It requires resisting the urge to fill the air, resisting the temptation to mistake urgency for meaning. The work now is observation, seeing what the hands reach for without instruction, what the mind circles back to without prompt. In that restraint, there is a slow, almost imperceptible alignment, the kind that cannot be forced into existence. And when the real direction appears, it will not burst in with drama. It will settle in like a weight in the chest, a steady pull towards something that cannot be ignored. That's the proof: it doesn't need to compete for attention, because it has always been there, waiting for the noise to end. The only question left is whether the silence will be endured long enough for it to be heard. This passage of darkness acts as a mirror for the unseen exchanges that quietly erode vitality. The most persistent drains are rarely dramatic, they are the ones that have blended so seamlessly into daily life that their pull is mistaken for normal. Under this shadow, those subtle fractures in the energy field come into focus: the inexplicable fatigue, the sudden heaviness brought on by the thought of a distant acquaintance, the way even stillness feels invaded. These are not fantasies of the mind, they are delayed recognitions from a system finally aligning with its own truth. The theft is not always deliberate. It may be woven into a bond that once felt nurturing, a habit that now clutters thought, or a belief about one's role in the world that tugs each time rest is attempted. In darkness, these quiet trespasses stand out like markings under ultraviolet light, messages from the body that imbalance is no longer tolerable. The task is not to sever ties in haste but to take inventory, to acknowledge the siphons for what they are. Awareness changes the contract, and once seen, such drains rarely survive unchallenged. Alongside this reckoning comes another revelation: the recognition that much of life has been navigated wearing a carefully constructed version of the self. It is the face offered to the world, the voice that answers when expected, the posture that fits the roles assigned. Over time, this mask grows so familiar that the line between it and what lies beneath blurs. This cycle does not request the maintenance of that version, it begins dismantling it piece by piece. The truer self, the one unshaped by performance or compromise, emerges only in the absence of external demand. It steps forward in spaces free from the weight of opinions, the hum of expectation, and the subtle choreography of fitting in. This is why connections loosen, why conversation feels thin, why even the reflection in the mirror seems to hold a stranger's gaze. It is not a loss but a stripping away, leaving behind the unadorned core. And perhaps the most challenging truth is that this unveiling is not about becoming something new, but about remembering what has been there all along, waiting for the noise to fall away.